"You've never been on a real mission." Colton said it lightly, almost kindly, the way you'd correct a child who'd gotten a fact wrong at the dinner table, and for a moment nobody at that table breathed. I watched my husband's jaw tighten the way it always did when his brother found a new way to say the same old thing. I watched his mother's hand pause halfway to the gravy boat. I watched Colton's fiancée, Brooke, glance at me with the particular apologetic wince of someone who'd learned to read the weather in that family long before I ever sat down at it. 4 words. That was all it took to turn a Sunday dinner into something else entirely. Something that would still be talked about on that base 8 months later. In break rooms and briefing halls, and at least one change of command ceremony, where a full-bird colonel would raise a glass in my direction without ever fully explaining why. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I set my fork down the way you set down something you're not finished kneading, and I said, "You're right." I haven't. I let the silence stretch exactly as long as it needed to. I've been on 11 that weren't real. Paperwork says so. Nobody laughed. Nobody was supposed to. I watched the silence move around that table like something with weight, settling first on Colton's father, who set down his wine glass without drinking from it, then on Brooke, who suddenly found her napkin fascinating, and finally on Colton himself, whose smile hung there a beat too long, the way a smile does when the person wearing it hasn't caught up yet to the fact that the room has already changed underneath him. I hadn't planned on any of it happening that night. I'd shown up to my in-laws' house in a grey cardigan and jeans, carrying a bottle of Cabernet and the specific, bone-deep exhaustion that comes from 4 consecutive overnight shifts and a flight home I'd slept through without meaning to. My husband Nathan had warned me on the drive over that his brother would be there, and he'd said it the way he always did, half apology, half brace. Colton Hale had a gift for making every room revolve around Colton Hale, and family dinners were his favorite stage of all. He was an Army Ranger, a captain now, and to his credit he'd worked hard to get there. The selection course alone had broken better men than him. But somewhere between the ceremony where they pinned his tab on and this dinner table, that hard work had curdled into something else. A hunger, low and constant, to be recognized as the family's one real soldier. The one who'd traded comfort for danger, and had the scars literal and rehearsed to prove it. Some of that hunger, I think, didn't start with him at all. It started with his father, a retired master sergeant who'd spent 30 years in the infantry and had never quite made peace with the quieter civilian life he'd landed in afterward. Family dinners at that house had always carried a faint undertow of rank, even among people who'd never worn a uniform. Colton's father sizing up every man who walked through the door by some invisible scale only he could see. And Colton, from what Nathan told me, had absorbed that scale before he was old enough to question whether it was a fair one. When Colton enlisted, and later when he made it through Ranger selection, his father had wept at the graduation ceremony, the only time in 20 years of marriage that Nathan's mother had ever seen him cry. It had given Colton, in one afternoon, the one thing his father had never quite given anyone else in that family: unqualified pride. He'd spent every year since chasing the feeling of that afternoon, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to, he'd started needing other people to occupy the lower rungs of that scale so he could keep standing on the higher one. He needed an audience. He needed more than that, a foil. And for 6 years, without ever once asking my permission, I had been his foil. I never talked about my work. Not because I enjoyed the mystery, and not because I was being coy, though I'll admit there were evenings I found the not talking almost restful, a kind of quiet you could live inside. I simply couldn't talk about it. 12 years in, most of what I'd done didn't belong to me to tell. It belonged to the men and women who had trusted me with their lives, in rooms with no windows, on aircraft that didn't appear on any manifest, in countries where, officially, no one like me had ever set foot. So when people asked, I gave them the true unsatisfying answer: intelligence support. Some liaison work. Nothing exciting. It cost me nothing to let them believe that. Or so I thought. Right up until the night it cost me a great deal more than I expected, and gave me back something I hadn't known I was missing. Dinner had started the way it always did, Colton's mother fussing over a roast that didn't need fussing over, his father topping off wine glasses like he was rationing something precious, and Colton working the table like it was a promotion board he'd personally convened. He'd made captain of his own narrative a long time before the army ever made him a captain of anything else. Tonight's material was a training rotation at the Joint Readiness Training Center, and he told it well, I'll give him that. The heat, the sleeplessness, the moment his squad held a perimeter through a simulated ambush that had, in his telling, come within a hair of becoming a very real disaster. People leaned in. Nathan squeezed my hand under the table, the small, apologetic gesture he always made when his brother got going, as if he could absorb some of it on my behalf. Then Colton's eyes drifted down the table to me. "What is it you do again, exactly?" he asked, in the tone of a man who already believes he knows the answer, and is only asking to let everyone else hear it confirmed. "Admin, right? Logistics?" "Something like that," I said. "Something like that," he repeated, smiling at his father, who chuckled the reflexive chuckle of a man who has learned it's easier to laugh with Colton than to sit in the silence that follows when you don't. "See, that's the thing. I love that for you. Somebody's got to keep the lights on back home." He said back home like it was a place, not a metaphor, like the war happened somewhere over there, and I lived permanently somewhere over here, folding towels while men like him carried the actual weight of it. No offense. It's just, there's a difference, you know, between doing a job and doing the job. You've never been on a real mission. That's not a knock. It's just true. That was when I set my fork down. I want to be honest about something. Because the version of this story that gets repeated later, and it did get repeated more times than I can count, in more rooms than I was ever in to correct it, tends to make me sound sharper than I actually was that night. I wasn't performing. I wasn't building to anything. I was simply tired in the specific way that makes you stop protecting other people's egos as carefully as you usually do. And Colton had, without knowing it, picked the one night in 6 years I no longer had the patience to let it slide. "You're right," I told him. "I haven't. I let that land the way truth does when nobody expects you to give it to them straight. I've been on 11 that weren't real. Paperwork says so." Colton laughed, a short, uncertain bark of a laugh, the kind people make when they're checking whether something was a joke. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means exactly what I said. I reached for my wine, not because I wanted it, but because I needed somewhere for my hands to go. Some of what I've done has a file with my name on it. Most of it doesn't. The stuff that doesn't isn't less real, Colton. It's just not yours to hear about. Same as most of what you've done isn't mine. That's—" He looked around the table for backup and found his father studying the tablecloth and his mother suddenly very interested in the roast. "That's a hell of a thing to say with no receipts." "I'm not asking you to believe me," I said. "I'm telling you the receipts exist. They're just not addressed to you." It should have ended there. So in a kinder version of that family it would have. But Colton had spent his whole adult life measuring his worth against a scoreboard only he could see. And for 6 years I had occupied a strange, unthreatening space on that board. A quiet in-law, easy to dismiss, easy to feel superior to. What I just said didn't fit anywhere on that board, and a man like Colton does not respond well to a number he can't place. "Sure," he said, in the falsely light tone of someone regrouping in real time. "Sure, okay. Whatever helps you sleep at night." Brooke, to her credit, tried to redirect the conversation toward the wedding, toward venues and seating charts and a cousin's allergy to shellfish, and for a while it worked, or seemed to. But I noticed, through the rest of that meal, the way Colton kept glancing down the table at me, not with anger exactly, but with the particular unsettled look of a man recalculating something he'd assumed was fixed. The drive home was quiet in the way that only certain drives are, the two of us moving through dark suburban streets with the radio off. Nathan's hands loose on the wheel, both of us processing something neither of us had words for yet. He didn't ask me what I'd meant. That was one of the things I'd loved about him from the very beginning. Back when we met at a mutual friend's barbecue 11 years ago, both of us newly transferred. Both of us tired in ways the other people at that barbecue couldn't have understood. He'd asked me exactly one question that first night. "What do you do?" And when I gave him the same true, unsatisfying answer I'd been giving everyone for years, he simply nodded and said okay, and never asked again. Not because he wasn't curious, because he understood somehow before I ever had to explain it to him, that curiosity and entitlement to an answer are two very different things. And he was never going to confuse the one for the other. It was one of the quiet reasons I'd married him. He never made me choose between honesty and honor. He simply waited on whichever side of the line I could stand on that day. "You okay?" he finally asked about 10 minutes from home, his eyes still on the road. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it mostly. I don't know why I said it like that tonight. I've let him say worse and let it go. "Because you're tired," Nathan said. "And because 6 years is a long time to let somebody build a whole personality out of underestimating you." He glanced at me just briefly. For what it's worth, I've wanted to say something like that to him for years. I just never had the ammunition. I laughed despite myself, a short, surprised sound in the dark car. "It's not ammunition, Nathan. It's just true." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it good ammunition." We didn't talk about it again that night. We got home, we checked on the kids, we got ready for bed the way we did every other Sunday of our married life. And if you'd told me then that 4 sentences at a dinner table were about to unravel 8 years of careful, practiced silence, I don't think I would have believed you. I certainly wouldn't have believed how far it would travel, or how many people it would eventually reach, or that a 2-star general I'd never expect to see again would be the one to pull the last thread loose in a room full of strangers 3 months later. I didn't think about it again until the following Tuesday, when my phone rang at 9 in the evening with a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. "Cross," the voice said. My maiden name, which almost no one outside the Navy still used, and even fewer said the way this man said it, flat and warm at once like a password that still worked. "It's Halverson. Tell me you're still up for a game of chess sometime, because I just heard the strangest thing at a retirement dinner in Norfolk. And I need to know if it's true." Master Chief Halverson had been part of the small, tight circle who'd known me at Task Force Obsidian, back when I still went by the name they'd given me, instead of the one I was born with. He wasn't supposed to call me on an unsecured line and say what he said next, and I'll never fully know why he did, except that old operators sometimes get careless with the truth once enough. Years have passed and enough of it no longer matters to anyone but the people who lived it. "Somebody's spreading your call. Sign around like it's a party trick," he said. Some ranger captain at Bragg, telling anybody who'll listen that his sister-in-law claimed to be Sentinel at Thanksgiving dinner, and he's trying to figure out if it's real or if she's, his words, lost her mind a little. I closed my eyes. Of course he had. Colton had spent the intervening days doing exactly what a man like him does, with a wound he can't stop touching. He'd turned my 4 sentences into a story. And then he'd turned that story into a joke, and jokes, unlike quiet truths. "Travel, it's real," I told Halverson. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a man deciding how much he's allowed to say out loud. "Figured," he said finally. "Nobody makes up a name like that by accident. You want me to do anything about it?" "No," I said. "Let it run its course." I lay awake a long time after Halverson's call that night, longer than I'd let myself in years, because saying the word real out loud to Colton had done something I hadn't expected. It had loosened a door in my own memory I usually kept shut without effort. The way you stop noticing a door you've closed 1,000 times. I don't talk about the valley. I'm not going to start now. Not in any way that matters, not in any way that would mean anything to someone who wasn't there. But I let myself remember that night, small pieces of it the way you're allowed to remember a fire without describing the burn. 9 days, a radio that worked exactly when it needed to and not 1 second longer. A young corpsman named Reyes who talked to himself when he was scared, quietly under his breath, counting backward from 20 like it was a superstition that had never once failed him. A decision, on the 6th night, that I still turn over sometimes at 3 in the morning, not because I think it was wrong, but because I know exactly what it cost and exactly who it was worth it for. I got 11 people out of that valley who weren't supposed to make it out. I've never told Nathan their names, and I never will, and it isn't because I don't trust him. It's because their names were never mine to give away, not even to the person I trust most in this world. That's the part Colton could never have understood from across a dinner table, no matter how many training rotations he'd survived. It isn't the danger that makes something a real mission. It's the weight of what you carry out of it that no one else is ever allowed to help you carry. I want to explain, because it matters to everything that came after, why I said that. I hadn't gone looking for vindication. I've built a life that doesn't depend on other people's recognition, because recognition was never the reason I did any of it. But I had also spent 6 years absorbing a small, steady erosion. Colton's jokes at holidays, his father's gentle condescension, the assumption, never spoken outright but always present, that I had chosen the safe path while the real family soldier had chosen the hard one. I was tired of it in a way I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that dinner. And some part of me, the part that had spent 12 years being patient in rooms where patience was the only option, decided it wouldn't cost me anything to simply let the truth move at its own pace and see where it landed. It landed faster than I expected. Nathan. Forgive me. Some names get stuck in the mouth from telling this story so many times to people who've heard other versions. Nathan told me about it 2 days later, delivered with the weary half-smile he always wore when relaying his brother's latest performance. Colton had been telling the story of Sunday's dinner to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen. His squad, his fiancée's parents, apparently even a stranger at the gym, recasting the moment as evidence of my flair for the dramatic, rather than the small earthquake it had actually been. Some people at the base started asking ranger buddies of his whether they'd ever heard of an operator who went by Sentinel. A couple of them had. None of them said what they knew out loud. Not to Colton, not yet. But Nathan told me their faces did something when they heard the name, something Colton noticed and couldn't explain and didn't like. "He thinks you're exaggerating," Nathan said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table one evening, after the kids were asleep, the particular caution in his voice of a man delivering news he wasn't sure how I'd take. "Or that people are just humoring you because of who you're married to." "I know," I said. I told him that wasn't it. He paused. He didn't want to hear it. I wasn't surprised. It's a strange thing, watching someone choose disbelief over an inconvenient truth, simply because the truth doesn't fit the shape of the story they've spent a decade building about themselves. Colton had constructed an entire identity around being the one who'd chosen the harder path, the one who wore the uniform while everyone else played it safe. And my 4 sentences at that dinner table had put a crack in the foundation he'd built that identity on. A man like that doesn't examine the crack. He tries to plaster over it as fast as possible, usually by proving the thing that caused it was never real to begin with. So he went looking for proof I was lying. I learned the details of this slowly. In pieces, mostly from Nathan, who got them from their mother, who got them from Colton in the unguarded, frustrated way people talk when they think they're only venting. Colton had a classmate from Ranger School who'd gone on to work an intelligence billet, a man with reasonable clearance and reasonable connections, and Colton had asked him, casually at first and then less casually, to see what he could find on a Navy officer named Cross, who might have operated under something called Task Force Obsidian sometime in the last decade. What he found, or rather, didn't find, only made things worse for him. He'd gone in expecting a paper trail, assignment history, a deployment record, some tidy list he could hold up next to his own and measure. Instead, every inquiry he made ran into the same quiet wall. Task Force Obsidian returned almost nothing beyond a designation and a single redacted line. Requests for anything further came back, stamped with the kind of clipped, bloodless language that tells you more by what it withholds than what it says. Access restricted. Clearance insufficient. His classmate, a man not easily rattled, told him flatly that whatever I'd been part of sat several tiers above anything he himself was cleared to see, and that continuing to push on it might draw exactly the kind of attention Colton did not actually want, drawn to himself. I heard, much later, how that conversation with his classmate had actually gone, second-hand through Nathan, who'd gotten it from Colton in one of the rare moments Colton let his guard down enough to admit how badly it had rattled him. He'd met the classmate, a soft-spoken intelligence officer named Petrov, at a diner off-base, laptop open, expecting an easy confirmation that would let him laugh the whole thing off at the next dinner. Instead, Petrov had gone quiet for a long moment after running the search, closed the laptop halfway and said, in the careful tone of a man choosing not to say something rather than choosing what to say, "Man, I don't know where you heard that name. But I'd stop asking about it if I were you." "Why?" Colton had pushed. "What does that mean?" "It means the query flagged something on my end that I'm not going to ask questions about, and neither should you." Petrov had said. Whatever she was part of, it's not the kind of thing that gets talked about at a diner. Drop it, man, seriously. Colton hadn't dropped it. Of course he hadn't. He'd gone home and stayed up half the night searching every open forum and veteran message board he could find for the word Sentinel, finding nothing but false leads and speculation, each dead end somehow making the real answer feel larger and more unreachable than the last. Nathan told me later that this was the week something in his brother genuinely started to change. Not the performance shifting, but the foundation under it. The first real crack in 6 years of certainty about exactly where everyone in that family stood. Nathan relayed all of this to me one night with something close to wonder in his voice, because even he, married to me for 9 years, had never known the specifics either. He's furious, he said, not because he thinks you're lying anymore. Because he can't prove you're telling the truth and somehow that's worse for him. He was right. It was worse. A man like Colton can survive being wrong. What he cannot survive is not knowing, because not knowing means he can no longer measure himself against you. And for a man whose entire self-worth is built on comparison, that uncertainty is a kind of quiet, private collapse. The story might have stayed contained to a few phone calls and some uneasy silences, if not for what happened 3 weeks later. At an engagement dinner, Colton and Brooke's families threw at the Officers' Club near Bragg, a bigger affair than our Sunday dinners, formal enough that Nathan wore his good jacket, and I wore the navy dress I keep for occasions I can't predict the shape of. I hadn't wanted to go. Something in me could already feel the outline of what that room was going to become. The way you feel a storm system before the sky actually changes color. But Nathan's mother had asked twice, and family obligations don't dissolve just because you'd rather skip them. The Officers' Club had the particular hush and shine of a room built for occasions bigger than the people currently standing in it, chandeliers dimmed just enough to flatter, a string quartet working through something forgettable near the windows, waitstaff moving with the practiced invisibility of people who'd done 100 of these nights before this one. Colton was in his element the moment we walked in, moving from cluster to cluster in his dress uniform, shaking hands, laughing at exactly the right volume, introducing Brooke to people who already knew her. I watched him work the room the way I'd watched him work every room for 6 years, and for the first time I found myself wondering, with something closer to sympathy than irritation, how much of that performance was armor rather than arrogance, how much of it was a man trying very hard to convince a room, and maybe himself, that he belonged in it. He caught my eye once, early on across the room, and something flickered across his face that hadn't been there at the Sunday dinner 3 weeks earlier, a flash of uncertainty, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Before he turned back to the circle of rangers he'd been holding court with, we were 20 minutes into cocktail hour when a man I didn't recognize crossed the room toward our small cluster near the bar. He was older, silver-haired, moving with the particular economy of someone who'd spent decades being careful with his knees. And he wore his dress uniform than snowy way men, wear something they've earned rather than something they're still proving they deserve. 2 silver stars sat on his shoulder. I felt the room's attention shift before I fully understood why. He stopped in front of me, studied my face for a long moment, with an expression I couldn't quite place, and then said quietly, almost gently, "Sentinel." I felt Colton go still 6 feet away. I felt Nathan's hand find the small of my back. "It's a common name," I said, which was true, and also in that room, entirely beside the point. "Not the way I heard it used," the general said. He introduced himself, Major General Ellery Voss, retired now. But he'd commanded a joint special operations element out of a location I still couldn't name in a room full of people I'd never confirm I'd met. I don't forget a call sign attached to a night like the one I'm thinking of. There aren't many people alive who can say what you did in that valley, and fewer who'd never once mention it at a party. He extended his hand. "It's an honor, ma'am, genuinely." I shook it because refusing would have made a scene larger than the one already quietly assembling around us. "Thank you, sir," I said. "I appreciate that." He held my hand a beat longer than a normal handshake requires, the way older men sometimes do when they're trying to communicate something they don't have the right words for in mixed company. And then he said loudly enough for the small cluster of people near us to hear, though not so loud it carried across the whole room, "Whoever told you that you'd never seen a real mission?" His eyes flicked briefly, unmistakably toward Colton. Doesn't know what they're talking about. He hadn't been at that Sunday dinner. He had no way of knowing what Colton had said, unless someone had told him. And I would learn later that someone had an aide of his. It turned out, married to a cousin of Brooks, who'd heard the story second-hand and mentioned it in passing weeks earlier, never imagining it would land in front of the one man in the entire United States Army who happened to actually know what Task Force Obsidian had done in that particular valley, in that particular winter. In a night I still don't discuss with anyone who wasn't there. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. General Voss moved on to greet the rest of the room, and the small cluster around us dispersed the way clusters do when they suddenly feel they've witnessed something they weren't quite meant to see, and I turned to find Colton staring at me across the room with an expression I'd never once seen on his face in 6 years of family dinners. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to the look of a man watching a floor he'd been standing on for years, quietly, silently, give way beneath him. Nathan didn't say anything until we were in the car, pulling out of the officers' club parking lot, the neon glow of the sign fading in the rearview mirror behind us. "I've been married to you for 9 years, he finally said, "and I've never seen anyone look at you the way that man just did." "He knew someone I used to work with," I said carefully. "That's all that was, Eleanor." He glanced over at me at a red light, something gentle and a little awed in his expression. "A 2-star general crossed an entire room to say one word to you. I don't need clearance to understand what that means." I didn't answer right away, watching the streetlights slide past the window, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from a long night, but from a long-held silence finally starting to show its seams in public. "It means what it means," I finally said. "I still can't tell you the rest of it." "I know," he said, and reached over to take my hand off the console between us. The same gesture he'd made 1,000 times, but heavier now somehow, with everything neither of us had said out loud. "I'm not asking you to. I just want you to know I saw it." Whatever it was. I saw it happen, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Colton, I learned later from his mother, had left the engagement dinner early that night, telling Brooke he had a headache, though Brooke suspected, and told me so herself months afterward, with a small knowing smile, that the headache had less to do with his temples than with the sight of a 2-star general treating his sister-in-law like a legend he'd personally have followed into a valley. He didn't call Nathan that week. He didn't bring it up at all, in fact, which was its own kind of answer, from a man who'd never once in 6 years let a silence sit unfilled if he could help it. News like that doesn't stay contained to one room. By the following week, the story of the engagement dinner had traveled through Bragg the particular unstoppable way these things always do, not through any effort of mine, but through the officers who'd been there, men and women who understood exactly what they'd witnessed and weren't especially inclined to keep it to themselves. I heard fragments of it secondhand for days, a captain mentioning it at a briefing, a staff sergeant asking a friend if the rumors about the ranger's sister-in-law were true, someone else apparently simply saying my name followed by a low whistle and a shake of the head. I didn't chase any of it down. I didn't need to. The truth, once it starts moving on its own, rarely needs an escort. It reached my own building before I expected it to, which should not have surprised me as much as it did. I worked by then in a nondescript office 3 miles from the base, the kind of building with no sign out front and a badge reader, instead of a receptionist, doing work that even most of the people inside it only understood in fragments relevant to their own small piece of it. My direct supervisor, a soft-spoken commander named Alvarez who'd known me for 4 years and had never once asked me a question he wasn't cleared to ask, stopped by my desk on a Wednesday afternoon with a look on his face I couldn't immediately place. "Got a strange call this morning," he said, leaning against the frame of my cubicle. "Public affairs officer over at Bragg, fielding questions from some junior officers about whether a woman named Cross assigned out of our building was, and I'm quoting here, a legitimate operator or an urban legend." He raised an eyebrow at me, not unkindly. "You want to tell me what's going on, or should I just enjoy the mystery?" "It's nothing," I said, which wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth either. "Family thing that got a little out of hand." "Family thing," he repeated. Clearly unconvinced, but he didn't push, because pushing wasn't something Alvarez did. Not with me, and not with anyone else in that building who'd earned the particular kind of trust that comes from years of never once needing to be checked up on. Well, for what it's worth, whatever answer they're looking for, I imagine they already have it. People don't usually ask if a legend is real, unless part of them already suspects it is. I thought about that exchange more than I expected to in the weeks that followed. There was something almost funny about it. The idea of my name traveling through hallways I'd never walked down, attached to a story I hadn't told, shaping itself in the mouths of people who'd never met me into something larger and stranger than the plain, tired truth of who I actually was. I've never been comfortable being a legend. I've spent most of my career trying very hard not to be memorable at all, because memorable in the work I did was usually a liability rather than a compliment. But there was nothing I could do to stop it once it started moving, and some part of me, tired from 6 years of being underestimated by exactly one person at exactly one dinner table, found I didn't especially want to stop it either. Colton's world, meanwhile, was quietly rearranging itself around him. Nathan told me it started small, a fellow ranger approaching him at the gym, asking with genuine curiosity rather than malice what it was like being related to Sentinel. Colton laughed it off the first time. He brushed past it the second. But by the third or fourth mention, something in him had visibly begun to shift. He wasn't used to being the secondary story in his own family, in his own life. For years he'd built his entire identity around being the one who'd chosen the harder path, the one who wore the uniform while the rest of us, in his private accounting, played it safe. And now, piece by piece, that foundation was being dismantled by men who'd never met me. Simply because they'd heard a name that meant something, they weren't cleared to explain. He came to see me himself. Eventually, on a rainy Thursday in early spring, 3 months after the dinner that started all of it, Nathan was at work. I was in the kitchen, folding laundry, half listening to the rain against the window, and thinking, if I'm honest, about nothing more complicated than whether we had enough coffee for the week when I heard his truck in the driveway. I recognized the particular rattle of it before I even looked outside. Colton had been meaning to get that muffler fixed for 2 years, and something in my chest tightened in the specific way it does before a conversation. You've been dreading without quite admitting to yourself that you were dreading it, I thought for one strange moment, about not answering the door. I dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it arrived. Whatever this was going to be, I'd rather meet it standing up in my own kitchen than let it find me some other way, some other day, on ground I hadn't chosen. He stood in my doorway for a long moment before he said anything. Rain still beaded on the shoulders of his jacket. And for the first time in 6 years, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not the smugness, not the performance. Something smaller and I think harder for him to carry. I need to know if it's true, he said. All of it. Not the pieces I've been hearing. I need to hear it from you. I can't tell you all of it, I said, and I watched something in his shoulders drop like he'd expected that answer and hated it anyway. That's not me being difficult, Colton. It's not a wall I built to keep you out specifically. It's a wall the job built, and it doesn't come down for anyone, including my own husband, including my own mother, including me some days when I wish I could tell somebody and just put it down for an hour. But it's real, he said. The name, the valley, whatever that general was talking about, it's real. He was quiet for a long moment, standing in my doorway with the rain still coming down behind him. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the performance I'd watched him do at 100 dinner tables. He walked further into the kitchen and sat down at the table without being asked, which he'd never once done in 6 years of visits, always waiting to be invited, always performing a kind of guest's politeness, even in a house he'd technically watched get built. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "And will you actually answer it, not the careful version you give everyone else?" "Depends on the question," I said, sitting down across from him. "Do you think I'm a coward?" The question surprised me enough that I took a moment before answering, and I watched him brace for whatever I was about to say the way you brace for a verdict you've already halfway convinced yourself of. "No," I said. "I think you're a man who found one thing in his life that made his father proud of him, and you've been terrified for years that if you ever stopped performing that thing loudly enough, the pride would go with it. That's not cowardice, Colton. That's just a wound nobody ever helped you look at. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands on my kitchen table. That's worse, he finally said. Somehow that's worse than if you'd just said yes. I've spent 6 years telling myself I was the one who did the hard thing, he said. The one who chose it. And you let me believe that. Every single time. I didn't let you believe anything, I said gently, because I understood by then that gentleness was the only thing that had any chance of reaching him. I never once told you I hadn't done something hard. You assumed it, Colton, because it was easier for you to assume than to ask. And I never corrected you because it cost me nothing. And it seemed to matter to you a great deal. It did matter, he said. And for the first time in 6 years, I heard something in his voice that sounded almost like grief. It was the one thing I had. The one place in this family where I wasn't. He stopped himself, and I watched him decide in real time whether to say the rest of it. Where I wasn't the younger brother who married well and got lucky. I needed to be the one who did something no one else in this family had done. And I built that on you not saying anything. And I never once thought about what it cost you to let me have it. I didn't have a clean answer for that, so I didn't try to give him one. I simply said, it cost me something. Not as much as you'd think, but something. He nodded slowly, and I watched him absorb that the way you absorb something you know you deserve, but wish you didn't. I'm sorry, he said. For the dinner. For all the dinners before it, honestly. I don't know how to undo 6 years of thinking I understood something I very clearly didn't. You don't undo it, I said. You just stop doing it going forward. That's the whole trick. He almost smiled at that, the ghost of the old performance flickering across his face and then falling away, replaced by something quieter and more honest. Will you tell me anything? He asked. Not the classified parts. Just, was it as bad as I'm imagining? The valley. Whatever happened there? I thought about how to answer that for a long moment, because some questions deserve more care than a quick reply, even when, especially when, you can't give the person asking the full truth. It was the worst 9 days of my life, I finally said. And I'd do it again tomorrow if the people I did it with asked me to. That's the only part of it I can give you, Colton. The rest belongs to them, not to me. There's a thing that happens among people who've done the kind of work I did. A quiet fellowship that has almost nothing to do with rank or service branch and everything to do with having once carried something you could never fully set down in front of people you loved. I'd felt it with Halverson on the phone that first night, in the particular careful warmth of his voice. I'd felt it with General Voss across a crowded room, in the way he'd said one word and let it carry 6 years of context neither of us needed to spell out. And sitting across from Colton that rainy afternoon, watching him try, clumsily and sincerely, to understand a world he'd never be allowed fully into, I felt something closer to that fellowship than I expected to feel for him. Not because he'd done the work. He hadn't, and he never would, not the way I had. But because he was, for the first time in 6 years, trying to see me rather than use me. And that effort, however late it came, was worth something. For what it's worth, I told him. Before he stood to leave, the hardest part was never the missions. Anyone can be brave for 9 days if the stakes are clear enough. The hard part is coming home afterward and pretending at every single dinner that nothing happened at all. That part doesn't get easier. You just get better at hiding how much it costs. He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. I don't think I ever once asked you how you were doing, he said quietly. Not really. Not underneath the jokes, no, I agreed. So you didn't. I'm going to start, he said, and I believed him, mostly because he didn't say it the way he said most things, loudly, for an audience. He said it quietly to me in an empty kitchen, with nobody else there to hear it and be impressed. He nodded again, and this time when he left, he didn't say anything else. He just squeezed my shoulder on his way out the door, an awkward, unpracticed gesture from a man who'd spent his whole life performing confidence, and had just for the first time in front of me, let himself be genuinely uncertain. Our daughter Maddie was 7 that spring, and she came home from school one Friday with a question that told me more clearly than anything else had, exactly how far this story had traveled beyond the walls I'd tried to keep it inside. She'd overheard her cousin, Colton and Brooke's niece on Brooke's side, a girl a year older who'd clearly overheard something at her own dinner table, say that Aunt Elena used to be a spy. Is it true? Maddie asked me that night, sitting cross-legged on her bed while I tucked her in, her eyes wide with the particular seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to a question like that. I sat down on the edge of her bed and thought carefully about how to answer, the way I'd learned to think carefully about most things involving my daughter and the parts of my life she wasn't old enough, and might never be old enough, to fully understand. I did important work for a long time, I told her. Work that helped keep people safe. Some of it I can't talk about, not because it's a secret game, but because talking about it could put other people in danger. Does that make sense? She considered this with the gravity of a much older person. Like a promise, she said. Exactly like a promise, I said. The most important kind. Uncle Colton said you never did anything real, she said. And I felt something twist briefly in my chest. Not anger exactly. More a tired recognition of how far careless words can travel before you ever learn where they landed. Is that true? No, I said gently. It isn't. And I think Uncle Colton knows that now too. Sometimes people say things before they understand them, and then later they learn better. That happens to grown-ups just as much as it happens to kids. She nodded. Satisfied in the easy way children are satisfied by answers that leave room for mystery, without leaving room for fear, and asked for one more song before lights out, and the conversation ended there. The way most important conversations in a house with young children eventually do, interrupted by bedtime, unfinished, carried quietly forward into whatever came next. There was one more scene before the wedding, smaller than the others, that I think mattered more than any of them. Though it took me a while to understand why. It was the rehearsal dinner the night before, a quieter affair at a restaurant downtown, with maybe 30 people instead of 200. I hadn't expected Colton to seek me out. The groom has 100 better things to do on the night before his wedding than corner his sister-in-law by the coat check. But he found me anyway, while Nathan was in the middle of a conversation with Brooke's father, and he stood there for a moment turning a glass of water in his hands, like he wasn't sure how to start. I've been thinking about something, he finally said. The thing I asked you, in your kitchen, about whether it was as bad as I was imagining. I remember, I said. I've been having a hard time with it, he admitted, and there was none of the old performance in his voice at all now, none of the practiced ease he brought to every other conversation in that restaurant. Not because I don't believe you, because I do now completely, and I keep thinking about how close I came to never knowing, and how I would have gone through my whole life thinking I was the only one in this family who ever actually risked anything. He shook his head slowly. That's a hard thing to sit with, knowing how wrong you were about someone you saw every Sunday for 6 years. You weren't wrong to not know, I said. You were only wrong about what not knowing meant. Most people who do the kind of work I did never get a moment like the one you got. They just live their whole lives being underestimated by people who never find out otherwise, and they're fine with that, because the not knowing was never really about them. It was about the job. That doesn't make me feel better, he said with a small, rueful, almost laugh. It's not supposed to make you feel better, I said gently. It's supposed to make you understand something you didn't before. Those aren't the same thing, and it's okay if it takes a while before they start to feel like they are. He nodded, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The noise of the rehearsal dinner going on comfortably around us, Brooke laughing at something across the room, his mother fussing with a seating chart. Nobody was going to follow the next day anyway. Tomorrow's going to be a good day, he finally said, more to himself than to me. I want it to be a good day for the right reasons this time. Not because I'm the one everyone's watching. It will be, I told him. Nobody's going to be watching anyone tomorrow except you and Brooke. That's how it's supposed to work. He smiled then, a real one, uncomplicated by the old need to be the center of whatever room he stood in, and went back to find his fiancée. And I stood by the coat check a moment longer, turning over the strange, quiet satisfaction of watching a person put down a weight they hadn't even known they were carrying. The real ending, if a story like this has one clean ending at all, came the next day, at Colton and Brooke's wedding. I hadn't expected anything to happen there. Weddings have their own gravity, their own script, and I assumed whatever reckoning Colton and I had reached in my kitchen that rainy Thursday would simply live quietly in the background of the day, unspoken, the way most real reckonings do. I stood near the back during the toasts. in a pale blue dress that had nothing to do with any uniform, holding Nathan's hand, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether the shellfish allergy situation had been handled correctly. Colton stood up when it was his turn, glass in hand, and began the way grooms usually begin, thanking parents, thanking Brooke's family, making the room laugh with a story about how they'd met. And then, without any warning I could have braced for, he turned toward our end of the table. "I want to say something about my sister-in-law," he said, and I felt Nathan go very still beside me, and I felt my own chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. Some of you have heard pieces of this story by now. I'm not going to pretend I know the whole thing, because I don't. And I've learned this year that I'm probably never going to. And that's—" He paused, and I watched him search for the right words in real time, in front of 200 people, without the Polish he usually brought to a room. "That's okay. It took me longer than it should have to understand that some of the strongest people you'll ever know are the ones who never once need you to know it." He lifted his glass a little higher, and I watched something shift in the room, to a quiet attentiveness that hadn't been there a moment before. "For 6 years I told myself I was the family's real soldier," he said. "Turns out I was just the loudest one. To Elena, the bravest person at this table, and the only one who never once tried to convince me of it." He looked at me directly then, something steady and unpracticed in his voice. "I'm sorry it took me this long, and I'm grateful you never stopped being patient with me while I figured it out." Glasses rose around the room, a soft chorus of agreement from people who mostly didn't know the specifics and didn't need to, and I felt the particular quiet grace of being seen by someone who had spent 6 years actively choosing not to see me. Nathan squeezed my hand under the table, the same gesture he'd made 100 times before, but it felt different that night, lighter. No longer carrying the weight of a secret, the two of us had quietly protected between just ourselves. His mother watched the whole thing with a kind of quiet pride I hadn't seen from her in all our years of family dinners. Brooke caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small warm smile, one woman to another, acknowledging something that didn't need further explanation. I looked around that room while the applause settled, at Colton's father, who had spent 30 years measuring men by a scale he'd never fully explained to anyone, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a way I don't think he expected anyone to notice. At Colton's mother, who had spent 6 years quietly refereeing a rivalry she'd never asked for, and clearly hadn't known how to stop. At Brooke, radiant and steady beside her new husband, holding a bouquet she'd chosen herself, and a life she was about to build with a man who had, in the space of a few months, become someone slightly different from who he'd been the year before. And I thought, not for the first time, that families rarely change all at once. They change the way water changes stone, slowly, unevenly, and usually only after something forces the current to run somewhere it hadn't run before. I didn't need the toast. I want to be honest about that, the same way I've tried to be honest about all of it. I built a life a long time ago that doesn't depend on anyone's recognition. Because recognition was never the point of any of it, not the missions, not the medal sitting in a drawer that no one else is cleared to open, not even the call sign that, for one strange season, upended an entire family's assumptions about who I was. I'd done the work because it needed doing, and I'd carried the silence because it was the cost of doing it honorably. But I won't pretend the toast meant nothing either. There's a particular quiet grace in finally being understood by the people who share your table, even when you never once asked them to understand you in the first place. Nobody at that wedding asked me how many missions I'd actually been on, or what Task Force Obsidian had really done in that valley, or what Sentinel had meant to the men and women who'd once depended on it in a place none of them will ever be cleared to hear about. They didn't need to anymore. They'd learned the hard way, the way families sometimes have to, that some of the strongest people you'll ever know are the ones who never once needed you to know it. I think about that dinner table often, the one where all of this started, the roast, the wine, the 4 words that were never meant to change anything, and somehow changed everything. I don't think Colton meant them as cruelty, not really, not the way I understood cruelty from other rooms in my life, the rooms I still can't fully describe to anyone I love. I think he meant them the way people mean most of the small, careless things that end up doing the most damage, as a way of feeling solid in a world that rarely offers anyone solid ground for very long. It's a strange thing, forgiving someone for a wound they didn't know they were causing. It's stranger still, watching that same person spend a year quietly rebuilding themselves around the shape of what they finally understood. I don't know that I'd have chosen this path if someone had handed me the choice. At the beginning, the general crossing the room. The rumors traveling through a building I'd spent a career trying to move through unnoticed. My own name turning into a word people said in hallways with a low whistle attached. I built a life around not being seen that way. I built a marriage around it, a career around it, a version of myself I was genuinely at peace with long before any of this happened. But I've also learned something in the years since that dinner that I don't think I could have learned any other way. And it's this. Being underestimated for years doesn't cost you anything you can't survive. But it costs the people who underestimate you something they eventually have to reckon with, whether or not you ever ask them to. And when they finally do, when the reckoning actually arrives, it tends to arrive exactly the way this one did, quietly. At first in a single word said by a stranger across a crowded room, and then all at once in a toast at a wedding, surrounded by people who finally understood what they'd been looking at the whole time. I smiled and let the moment be exactly what it was. Not vindication, not victory, just a family finally, standing on solid, honest ground. If this story found you somewhere tonight, I'd love to know where. Leave a comment and tell me what part of it stayed with you the longest. Stories like Elena's remind us that real strength rarely announces itself, and that the people we underestimate are often carrying more than we'll ever know. We share stories like this every day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. There's always another journey waiting for us to take.